No one ever thinks a storm is choosing sides until it leaves someone at your door. The wind hit Daniel Hayes's garage like a freight train off the plains, rattling the sheet metal walls hard enough to make the hanging wrenches clink together in nervous rhythm. The thermometer nailed beside the service bay door read -27 degrees Fahrenheit, and dropping. Snow slid sideways across the single dusty window, thick and relentless, burying the junked pickup in the yard inch by inch. Inside, the only steady sound was the uneven hum of a space heater Daniel had rebuilt from salvaged parts, its orange coils flickering as if thinking about giving up. He tightened the last bolt on a cracked transmission casing and wiped his hands on a rag already stiff with old grease. Power had gone out an hour ago across the county. The grid couldn't handle storms like this anymore. He'd learned to rely on what he could fix himself. The garage smelled like cold iron and motor oil, familiar, honest things. Then came the sound that didn't belong. 3 dull knocks against the outer door. Not the wind. Not loose siding. Knuckles. Daniel froze, head tilted, listening past the howl of 40-mile-per-hour gusts. The knocks came again, weaker this time. He crossed the concrete floor in 4 long steps and pulled the door open just enough to see through the curtain of white. At first he thought it was a trick of the light, a reflection off the drifts. Then the shape moved. A figure knelt in the snow, one hand braced against the frame of his old tool chest he kept outside for scrap. Her skin wasn't pale from cold. It was blue. Not the blue of frostbite. Deeper. Like twilight before full dark. Snow collected in her hair, long and silver white, whipping across her face as she looked up at him. Her eyes caught what little light spilled from the garage and held it, gold, steady, unafraid. She didn't beg. She didn't reach for him. She just met his stare like she was measuring something. "If you open this door," she said, her voice controlled despite the wind, "others will follow." The accent was there, subtle but precise, each word placed carefully. Daniel glanced past her into the empty road disappearing under fresh snow. No headlights. No engines. Just the storm. He looked back at her, at the thin fabric clinging to her shoulders, already crusted with ice. "Lady," he said evenly, stepping aside, "you're going to freeze solid in about 5 minutes." Her gaze sharpened. "You do not understand." "Maybe not," he replied, reaching for the handle. "But I understand cold." For half a second, she hesitated, as if the decision mattered more than survival. Then she pushed herself to her feet with quiet effort and stepped inside. Snow melted instantly against the concrete near the heater. Up close, he could see faint lines along her skin, like patterns under glass, shifting softly with each breath. She stood taller than he expected, shoulders straight despite whatever had driven her into the storm. Daniel shut the door against the wind and slid the deadbolt into place. The garage fell into thick, insulated silence, broken only by the heater's tired hum. She scanned the room quickly, the tools, the patched walls, the faded American flag tacked above his workbench, cataloging it all. "Why?" she asked, finally looking back at him. Daniel grabbed a spare thermal blanket from a shelf and held it out without ceremony. Because nobody should have to fight a blizzard alone. The heater clicked louder as the temperature inside the garage climbed a few stubborn degrees, the orange coils painting her blue skin in shifting bands of copper light. Daniel watched as she accepted the thermal blanket, not with desperation but with measured restraint, as if taking charity required calculation. She draped it over her shoulders and closed her eyes briefly, inhaling the warmer air like someone cataloging a foreign atmosphere. Meltwater pooled at her boots and traced thin lines across the concrete toward a drain that had not worked in years. Up close, the faint patterns beneath her skin pulsed softly, almost like circuitry responding to heat. Daniel turned back to the workbench and adjusted the space heater with a flathead screwdriver, coaxing a steadier hum from the tired motor. "That thing safe?" she asked quietly, her voice smoother now that the wind was gone. "Safer than the grid," he replied. "Rebuilt it after the blackout 2 winters ago." County said help was coming. It never did. She studied him again, more carefully this time, as if the statement carried weight beyond small talk. You remain here by choice, she asked. Mostly by mortgage, he said, reaching for a second blanket and tossing it over a wooden chair. Town used to be bigger. Mining jobs dried up. Folks left. I fix what breaks for whoever is still around. Her gaze shifted to the wall where a framed photograph hung slightly crooked above the tool cabinet. A woman with dark hair stood beside Daniel in front of the same garage, sunlight instead of snow at their backs. The frame was dusty but not neglected. You are alone, she said, not as a question. Daniel wiped his hands again, slower this time. Have been for a while. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. Outside, the storm intensified, wind screaming across the metal roof in long, rising waves. She moved closer to the heater, extending her hands toward the coils. The blue of her skin deepened as warmth returned, and the subtle lines along her arms brightened faintly, responding like fibers under current. Your world is harsher than I expected, she said. This is just North Dakota in January, Daniel replied. You should see July. For the first time, something like curiosity softened her expression. You speak as if endurance is ordinary. It is, he said. Out here, you prepare, or you freeze. She lowered herself carefully into the chair, movements controlled, disciplined. Not weak. Not fragile. Just conserving energy. You were warned, she reminded him. If they track me here, you will face consequences. Daniel walked to the metal cabinet near the back wall and pulled out a small first aid kit, setting it on the bench between them. If someone comes looking, he said evenly, we will deal with that when it happens. He paused, then added, you bleeding anywhere I cannot see? Her golden eyes locked onto his, assessing the question for hidden motive. Finding none, she shook her head once. No. My injury was exhaustion, not damage. He nodded, accepting that answer as truth. Good. Because I am better with engines than people. A faint curve touched her lips, subtle but unmistakable. That is unfortunate, she said softly, because tonight you have chosen to repair both. The wind did not let up, but sometime after midnight it changed its voice, dropping from a furious howl to a low, steady roar that pressed against the garage walls like a living thing testing their strength. Daniel fed another salvaged extension cord into the backup battery he kept under the workbench and checked the fuel level on the small generator outside, watching the gauge through a narrow crack in the door before sealing it again. The air inside carried the mixed scent of heated dust and thawing snow. When he turned back, she was standing, not from weakness but from restlessness, studying a disassembled carburetor laid out in neat rows on the steel table. Her fingers hovered above the parts without touching them. You reduce complex systems into components, she observed. It is easier to repair what you can see in pieces. Daniel shrugged. Engines make sense. Air, fuel, spark. Give them what they need, they run. Starve one part, everything fails. She looked at him with renewed intensity. It is similar where I come from. The patterns beneath her skin brightened briefly, then dimmed, as if reacting to thought. You govern machines, she continued, with principles. Yet you opened your door without calculation. He met her gaze without flinching. That was calculation. She tilted her head slightly. Explain. Storm like this, county roads closed, temperature below zero, wind chill around -40. Odds of survival alone outside are close to none. He leaned back against the bench. I did the math. For a moment she seemed to consider that answer as seriously as if it were a diplomatic statement. And if the ones pursuing me arrive, she asked. Daniel wiped a thin line of melted ice from the floor with his boot. Then we will talk. You assume they will talk. Most people prefer talking to paperwork, he said. A faint flicker of something crossed her face, not amusement exactly, but recognition of stubborn resolve. She walked toward the small window, brushing condensation aside with the back of her hand. Outside was only white and shadow, the world erased beyond 30 feet. They track energy signatures, she said quietly. Metallic structures. Heat emissions. Repeated patterns. Daniel glanced at the heater and then at the generator readout. This place barely registers on the grid. Power flickers every other week. Nobody important checks here. Her eyes shifted back to him. You underestimate yourself. Been doing it for years, he replied. Silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, just heavy with things unsaid. The heater steadied, humming with stubborn persistence. Snow tapped softly against the roof now instead of slamming it. She stepped away from the window and stood within the circle of orange light again. My name, she said at last, voice level and deliberate, is Lyra Valen. Daniel nodded once. Daniel Hayes. She repeated it under her breath, as if testing the sound against some internal register. Daniel Hayes, she said again, and the way she spoke it made it feel less like introduction and more like acknowledgement. Outside, the storm shifted once more, and somewhere far off beneath the wind, a distant vibration hummed through the frozen ground, too low to be thunder and too steady to be random. Lyra's gaze sharpened instantly, the faint lines beneath her skin flaring with quiet light. They are closer than I calculated, she said. Daniel did not reach for a weapon. He did not move toward the door. He simply straightened, listening to the same low tremor carry through the concrete slab under his boots. Then we have a little time, he answered calmly, as the heater continued to burn against the cold and the snow kept falling. The vibration did not fade. It grew steadier, threading through the frozen ground like a distant engine running at constant throttle. Daniel walked to the breaker panel near the back wall and flipped off 2 unnecessary circuits, dimming half the overhead lights. The garage dropped into deeper shadow, illuminated mostly by the stubborn glow of the heater coils. Lower your energy output, Lyra said quietly, eyes half closed as if listening to something beyond sound. They triangulate patterns. Daniel nodded and crouched beside the generator control box, adjusting the throttle until the hum softened to a restrained purr. This place already looks like it is falling apart, he said. Let us not make it interesting. Lyra stepped closer to him, the faint lines beneath her skin pulsing brighter for a moment before settling into a controlled rhythm. They will not arrive loudly, she warned. They prefer presence over spectacle. So do repo men, Daniel replied calmly. He stood and crossed the garage to the side door that led into the small attached house. The interior lights were already off, curtains drawn tight against the storm. He checked the old deadbolt, then returned to the main floor. The low tremor shifted direction, circling rather than approaching straight on. Lyra's posture changed subtly, shoulders squaring, chin lifting. Not fear. Calculation. They are scanning the perimeter, she said. Testing heat signatures. Daniel glanced at the heater again. If I shut that off, you freeze. I will endure, she answered. I will not have you endure my consequences. He studied her face for a second longer than before. You did not choose this storm, he said. And I chose to open the door. For the first time since the vibration began, uncertainty flickered across her features. Outside, the wind carried a new sound beneath it, a smooth displacement of air that did not belong to weather. Snow swirled past the narrow window in unnatural spirals, pulled by forces beyond the gale. Daniel walked to the tool rack and lifted a heavy welding mask, not as a weapon but as habit, sliding it onto the bench within reach. He wiped his palms on his jeans and faced the door. Daniel Hayes, Lyra said, voice lower now, steady but urgent, if they find me within your structure, your government will not protect you. He gave a small, almost tired smile. My government does not even fix potholes on this road. The displacement outside intensified, compressing the snow in smooth circular patterns across the yard. Through the frost-lined glass, faint silhouettes formed against the white horizon, tall and precise, unmoving despite the wind. Lyra inhaled slowly, centering herself. The glow beneath her skin brightened in controlled waves, not wild, not panicked, but purposeful. "They are not here to negotiate," she said softly. Daniel stepped forward until he stood between her and the door, not dramatically, not heroically, just naturally, as if positioning himself between a draft and a flame. "Then they can knock," he replied. The heater continued its low hum behind them, pushing back against the cold as the storm thinned to a whisper and the silhouettes outside solidified into waiting shapes in the snow. The first knock was not loud, but it carried authority, a single measured impact against the metal door that cut clean through the hum of the heater and the fading wind. Snow slid from the roof in a soft cascade as the vibration beneath the ground steadied into a controlled presence. Daniel did not move immediately. He counted 3 breaths, slow and even, then stepped forward and unlocked the deadbolt without theatrics. Lyra's glow intensified behind him, not wild, but focused, like a circuit engaging. "Do not open it fully," she murmured. Daniel cracked the door just wide enough to see past the drifting snow. Outside, 5 figures stood in perfect alignment, their silhouettes sharp against the white field. Their armor reflected the faint dawn light beginning to edge the horizon, smooth and seamless, untouched by frost. No weapons were raised. No voices were shouted. They simply waited. The center figure inclined its head slightly, an acknowledgement rather than a demand. A calm, amplified voice carried through the narrow opening, precise and resonant. "Resident of this structure. We are conducting retrieval of a high-value individual. You are not our objective." Daniel leaned one shoulder against the frame. "Morning to you too," he said evenly. "Road is closed. Storm advisory." There was a brief pause, not confusion but recalibration. "Your assistance is not required," the voice continued. "Surrender the individual within, and your property will remain unaffected." Behind him, Lyra stepped closer, her presence steady as steel. Daniel did not turn around. "Nobody here asked to be surrendered," he replied. "She came in because she was freezing." A faint shift rippled through the formation outside, subtle but synchronized. "You are unaware of her designation," the voice stated. Daniel glanced back at Lyra, just long enough to see the controlled tension in her posture. She gave the smallest nod, as if granting him ownership of the moment. He faced the door again. "I am aware she needed heat," he said. The dawn brightened another shade, pale blue pressing through the thinning storm clouds. The snow between the figures remained undisturbed, as if held in place by invisible boundaries. "Your world does not understand the implications," the voice continued. "This individual's presence destabilizes regional authority." Daniel exhaled slowly. "This is a garage," he answered. "The only thing destabilized here is my power bill." A silence followed, longer this time. Lyra stepped forward until she stood just behind Daniel's shoulder, her voice no longer directed at him but outward. "Stand down," she commanded, tone sharp and unmistakably sovereign. The lines beneath her skin flared in deliberate symmetry, casting faint blue light across the concrete floor. Outside, every figure lowered its head in immediate, disciplined response. The amplified voice returned, now softened. "Your Highness, we are instructed to ensure your secure return." Daniel blinked once but did not step aside. Lyra's gaze moved past him, resolute. "I am secure," she said. "Withdraw your perimeter." The figures outside shifted in perfect unison, formation loosening as the displacement in the air began to fade. Snow resumed its natural drift, wind reclaiming the yard in quiet swirls. Daniel remained where he was until the last silhouette dissolved into the white horizon and the low vibration beneath the ground finally stilled. He closed the door gently, sliding the bolt back into place. The heater hummed on, steady and defiant. Lyra looked at him, the glow beneath her skin gradually dimming to a soft pulse. "You stood between me and an empire," she said quietly. Daniel walked back to the workbench and picked up his rag. "No," he replied. "I stood between you and the cold." The silence that followed was heavier than the storm had been, thick and unfamiliar, pressing into the corners of the garage where cold air still lingered. Daniel set the rag down and walked to the window, wiping a clear strip through the condensation with the side of his hand. Outside, the snow lay smooth and untouched again, no tracks, no impressions, just a wide white field stretching toward the county road. If anyone drove past later, they would see nothing unusual. He let out a slow breath that fogged the glass and turned back toward Lyra. The glow beneath her skin had faded to a faint, steady shimmer, no longer defensive, just alive. "Your Highness," he said carefully, testing the words. Lyra held his gaze without flinching. "That title is not required here," she replied. "It carries weight where I come from. It carries distance." Daniel nodded once. "All right. Lyra, then." She stepped closer to the heater again, the orange coils reflecting in her golden eyes. "You have altered the trajectory of more than you realize," she said. "My absence destabilized alliances. My retrieval would have restored certain factions. Your refusal forced them to acknowledge my choice." Daniel leaned against the workbench, crossing his arms. "I did not refuse an empire. I refused to hand over someone who did not want to go." "Intent does not limit consequence," she answered softly. "It rarely does." He considered that, then glanced at the faded photograph on the wall. "You said my world is harsh. It is not always the weather. Sometimes it is people making decisions for you." Lyra followed his gaze to the photograph. "And you chose differently." "Someone once did that for me," he said, voice even, without detail. "Gave me shelter when I had nothing left." The heater clicked as the fuel feed adjusted, steady and dependable. Lyra moved toward the open carburetor on the bench, studying the precise arrangement of parts. "Your society classifies you as economically limited," she observed. "Yet your actions indicate surplus." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Surplus?" "Compassion," she clarified. "You possessed enough to share." He gave a small, almost reluctant smile. "It does not cost much." She looked at him more closely then, not as a ruler assessing a citizen, but as someone trying to understand a variable that did not fit prior models. "On my world," she said slowly, "protection is earned through status. Power shields power. You reversed that equation." Daniel shrugged. "Heat works the same for everybody." Outside, the first real sunlight since the storm began pushed through thinning clouds, casting pale gold across the snow. The temperature would still be below zero, but the light changed everything. Lyra walked to the door and rested her hand lightly against the cold metal. "They will regroup," she said. "They will report that I issued direct command. My claim strengthens because I stood by it." Daniel studied her profile in the morning light. "So what happens now?" She turned back toward him, posture composed, sovereign without the armor. "Now," she said, "I decide how my reign begins." The heater hummed behind them, steady against the lingering cold, and for a moment the small garage felt larger than the storm, larger than the empire waiting beyond the horizon. Morning settled over the frozen fields with a pale, deliberate light, turning the endless white into something almost gentle. The storm had passed, but the cold remained sharp, reading 5 degrees below zero on the small digital display Daniel kept by the workbench. He poured 2 cups of black coffee from a dented thermos and handed one to Lyra without ceremony. She accepted it with curiosity, watching the steam rise before taking a careful sip. Her expression shifted, not displeased, simply registering something new. "Bitter," she said quietly. "It wakes you up," Daniel replied. "Out here, that matters." The garage felt smaller in daylight, more ordinary. The cracked concrete, the oil stains, the faded red toolbox that had been his father's. Nothing about it suggested decisions that could shift interstellar politics. Lyra walked slowly along the wall, studying the tools hung in precise order. Your life is structured around repair, she observed. Engines, generators, broken things. Daniel leaned against the hood of the old pickup buried halfway in snow outside the open bay door. If it can be fixed, I fix it. If it cannot, I learn why. She paused beside the photograph again. And if what is broken is not mechanical? He followed her gaze. Then you do what you can and live with the rest. A long silence followed, not uncomfortable, but heavy with meaning. Outside, the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the snowfield. The world looked clean, untouched, as if the night had not happened at all. Lyra set the coffee cup down and faced him fully. They will return, she said. Not with force, but with expectation. They will anticipate my departure. Daniel nodded once. And are you leaving? She considered the question carefully, as if it deserved precision. Yes, she said at last. But not because they demand it. He did not ask when. He did not ask how. Instead, he walked to the heater and switched it off. The sudden quiet felt significant. I have one request, Lyra continued. Daniel looked up. All right. When they come again, I want them to see this place exactly as it is. Not fortified. Not afraid. A faint smile touched his mouth. That is easy. I do not have much for them to misunderstand. She stepped closer, stopping just within arm's reach. The faint glow beneath her skin brightened subtly in the morning light. Daniel Hayes, she said softly, your world measures wealth in currency. Mine measures it in influence. You possess something neither system accounts for. He met her eyes evenly. And what is that? You acted without negotiation, she answered. Without calculation of advantage. That is rarer than power. He shrugged lightly. It was cold. Outside, a low hum began to ripple through the air again, distant but unmistakable. Not aggressive. Not hidden. Intentional. Daniel glanced toward the horizon where faint shapes were beginning to form against the bright sky. Lyra straightened, composure settling over her like a mantle reclaimed. This time, she said, they will not come to retrieve me. Daniel folded his arms loosely across his chest. Then what are they coming for? Lyra's golden eyes reflected the widening light. To witness the kind of ruler I choose to be. The hum in the sky grew clearer, no longer masked by wind or distance, but steady and deliberate, like a held note that refused to break. Daniel stepped out of the garage and onto the packed snow, boots crunching against a thin crust of ice formed overnight. The air was painfully clean, sharp enough to sting the lungs. Above the horizon, a sleek metallic vessel descended without flame or roar, displacing air in smooth circular ripples that pressed the snow outward in perfect rings. It did not land with impact. It hovered 20 feet above the ground, controlled, patient. Lyra followed him outside, the cold no longer biting her skin the way it had the night before. The faint luminescent lines beneath her surface brightened in symmetrical patterns, not defensive now, but ceremonial. Daniel folded his arms against the chill and watched without stepping back. A narrow platform extended from the underside of the craft, lowering in silence until it rested inches above the snow. 3 figures emerged, their armor gleaming in the morning light, movements precise and unhurried. They did not approach Daniel. They stopped several yards away and bowed in unison toward Lyra. The gesture was unmistakable. Your Highness, the lead figure spoke, voice amplified yet measured, carrying across the frozen yard without distortion. The council acknowledges your sovereign command. Lyra stood tall, shoulders squared, her presence steady and composed. You acknowledge my authority, she corrected calmly. Authority is not granted by retrieval. It is affirmed by choice. The figures remained bowed for a moment longer before rising. Daniel felt the cold seep through the soles of his boots, but he did not shift. The lead figure continued, "The factions opposing your ascent have withdrawn provisional claims. Your actions last night have recalibrated internal support." Lyra's gaze flicked briefly toward Daniel, then back to the delegation. "Good," she said. "Then we begin differently." A faint breeze stirred the snow at their feet. Daniel cleared his throat quietly. "So this is not an arrest," he said. The lead figure turned its helmet slightly toward him, reflective surface catching his image in curved distortion. "You are the human resident," it stated. "Your intervention altered succession variables." Daniel gave a small shrug. "I offered heat." Lyra's lips curved in the faintest smile. "And in doing so," she said, "he offered example." The delegation paused, as if processing that statement beyond protocol. The lead figure inclined its head again, this time not only to Lyra but slightly toward Daniel. "The Empire recognizes voluntary compassion as strategic strength," it said. "Your dwelling will remain unmonitored." Daniel exhaled slowly, breath visible in the cold air. "Appreciated." Lyra stepped forward, stopping just short of the platform. The light beneath her skin intensified, radiating outward in controlled waves that shimmered faintly against the snow. "I will return with you," she declared. "But not as reclaimed property. As ruler." The delegation bowed once more. The hovering vessel adjusted its position subtly, waiting. Lyra turned back to Daniel, the morning sun catching gold in her eyes. "I will remember this place," she said quietly. Daniel glanced at the garage, at the crooked sign above the bay door, at the heater that had burned through the night. "It is not much," he replied. "It was enough," she answered. The platform began to rise as she stepped onto it, the air around them humming softly with contained power. Snow drifted gently across the yard again, ordinary and quiet. As the vessel lifted toward the bright winter sky, the vessel rose without sound, its surface catching the winter sun until it became a silver shard against the pale sky, then a distant star, and finally nothing at all. The air settled back into ordinary stillness, the kind that belongs to empty fields and forgotten highways. Daniel stood in the snow a moment longer than necessary, hands buried in his jacket pockets, watching the space where it had vanished. The cold pressed in again, sharp and honest, 5 degrees below zero and dropping with the wind returning from the north. He turned and walked back into the garage, closing the bay door behind him until the world was reduced to metal walls and the faint smell of oil. The heater remained off. The silence felt earned. Sunlight filtered through the small window, cutting a clean line across the workbench and illuminating the disassembled carburetor exactly where he had left it. Nothing in the room suggested that an empire had hovered 20 feet above the yard less than 5 minutes ago. Daniel moved slowly, picking up the rag, tightening a bolt he had already tightened, resetting tools into their familiar order. Motion restored rhythm. Rhythm restored perspective. On the bench near the heater sat the empty coffee cup Lyra had used, a faint crescent of frost still clinging to the rim where warmth had once met winter air. He stared at it for a second, then carried it to the small sink and rinsed it clean. Outside, a pickup truck rolled cautiously down the county road, tires crunching over packed snow. The driver slowed near the driveway, probably curious about the strange circular pattern still faintly visible in the yard. The truck idled for a moment, then continued on, leaving only exhaust in its wake. Daniel glanced at the old digital thermometer again. 4 degrees below zero now. Just another January morning. He reached for the breaker panel and restored full power to the overhead lights. The garage brightened, ordinary and imperfect. He stepped back outside once more, boots leaving fresh prints over the perfectly smooth rings in the snow where the vessel had hovered. He did not try to preserve them. Wind would take care of that soon enough. The horizon looked exactly as it always had, flat and endless, stretching beneath a sky too wide for secrets. A faint vibration lingered in the air, almost imagined, then faded completely. Daniel squinted toward the sun and shook his head slightly, as if clearing out a long night. He was not a diplomat. Not a soldier. Not a man of influence measured in titles. He was a mechanic with a stubborn heater and a mortgage that still needed paying. He walked back into the garage and closed the door, flipping the heater back on until the orange coils glowed steady again. The hum returned, small but defiant against the cold. He picked up his wrench and leaned over the engine block, breath steady, hands sure. Outside, snow drifted softly across the yard, erasing circles, smoothing edges, leaving no trace of arrival or departure. But in the quiet between the heater's hum and the turning of steel against steel, something had shifted. Not in the sky. Not in